This video is brought to you by Surfshark. Safety and security online are critically important, and you can protect yourself online with Surfshark. Get 83% off and 3 months for free through the link in the description below. Long before there was 9/11, there was Lockerbie. A small, unremarkable Scottish town was preparing for Christmas in 1988 when hell rained down from the sky. The south of the town was destroyed in a massive fireball, flattening houses and killing residents in their beds and at their kitchen tables. The horror was only magnified when surviving residents emerged to discover hundreds more bodies scattered everywhere, along with aircraft wreckage that stretched for miles outside of the town. An American plane had been blown out of the sky over their heads, and the pieces had crashed down on top of them. Overnight, Lockerbie had become a byword for terror. The disaster at Lockerbie sparked outrage across the globe, heightening diplomatic tensions and prompting an international investigation. It also changed the way Americans looked at air travel, as they recognized that they were not immune from the horrors of terrorism. Security procedures were heightened, passengers and bags began to be scrutinized closely, and law enforcement agencies began to ramp up counter-terrorism efforts. But at the same time, terrorists began to realize that American aviation was a potent target with horrific and deadly consequences for thousands of innocent people. On December 21st, 1988, Lockerbie was just your average place. Located in the southwestern portion of Scotland known as Dumfries and Galloway, Lockerbie is the kind of place you pass on your way to somewhere else. The River Annan passes to the west of Lockerbie, while the A74 dual carriageway goes right through the heart of the town on its way to Glasgow, 125 kilometres to the north, following a path set by the railways as far back as the 19th century. Very few people stop in Lockerbie. The town only has a population of 4,000 residents. It's the kind of quiet place you move to raise a family, away from all the drama of the rest of the world. On that day in 1988, the residents of Lockerbie were preparing for Christmas. Decorations were up, presents carefully concealed, and planning for holiday parties and church services were in full swing. Most people probably didn't even realize that 30,000 feet over their heads another highway had been erected, an aircraft traffic corridor populated by jumbo jets like Pan Am Flight 103. For a long time, when you thought of American aviation, you'd think of Pan Am. Pan American World Airways had been flying passengers internationally for decades by 1988. At one point, it was the largest, most successful airline in the entire world. The Pan Am logo, known as the blue meatball, and the distinctive uniforms worn by its crew were cultural touchstones, and so were the beautiful airplanes they flew, known as Clippers. The largest of these was the massive Boeing 747, the original jumbo jet. Pan Am was the first airline to fly the 747, and at one point had over 30 of them in service. But all the nostalgia and reputation in the world couldn't disguise the fact that the airline was in deep trouble in 1988. Increased competition from both domestic and international carriers, as well as a series of poor business decisions, had put Pan Am in a deep financial hole throughout the 1980s. If it was going to dig its way out, Pan Am needed its bread and butter routes, like London to New York, to produce for them. Pan Am Flight 103 was one of those producers, scheduled to fly from London's Heathrow Airport to New York City's JFK International on the night of December the 21st. The flight was carrying a total of 259 people, mostly Americans heading home for the holidays, but also including passengers from 20 other countries. The Boeing 747, named Clipper Maid of the Seas, took off from Heathrow at 6:25 p.m. local time, following what was known as the Daventry departure profile that took it north over Scotland before turning west to fly over the Atlantic to New York. One of dozens of small towns that Pan Am 103 planned to fly over that night was Lockerbie. That was where Pan Am 103 was at 7:02 p.m., flying at 360 miles per hour at an altitude of 31,000 feet. That is when disaster struck. A rumble was heard over the town of Lockerbie. Most probably mistook it for thunder at first, but instead of fading away, the rumbling got louder and louder, rattling windows and lifting roof tiles. Then, black objects began raining down from the sky, adding to the noise as they hit houses and sidewalks. By now, many people were looking at the sky above when a massive fireball broke through the clouds and came streaking towards the south end of the town. It struck the ground at Sherwood Crescent, completely obliterating multiple homes in a tremendous explosion. Fire spread from house to house post-impact until most of the block was ablaze. On the A74 dual carriageway, Galloway, cars burned in the southbound lanes. Debris continued to fall all over Lockerbie in the minutes after the explosion, the larger pieces smashing into homes on Rosebank Crescent, half a mile away from Sherwood. Some of the lighter objects landed intact on the ground and included airline tickets and seat cushions that identified it as belonging to Pan Am Flight 103. All night, an army of firefighters, police officers and paramedics poured into Lockerbie. By daybreak, the fire brigade had the blaze under control, and the morning light revealed the true scale of the disaster. At Sherwood Crescent, a crater had been gouged into the ground 15 stories deep. Family homes had been reduced to unrecognizable heaps of charred rubble. Investigators would later determine that the center section of the aircraft, including the wings, which contains more than 100 tons of jet fuel, had smashed down to Earth at over 500 miles per hour. The rest of Pan Am Flight 103 had been scattered over an area larger than the entire city of London. 4 kilometers east of Lockerbie, in the village of Tundergarth, the aircraft's nose came down in a field opposite a church. It was relatively intact, with the crew members' bodies still strapped inside. The position of the switches and gauges indicated that the pilots had absolutely no warning that anything was going wrong. The bodies of the passengers were found all over Lockerbie, some still strapped to their seats, most with the majority of their clothes torn off. Most of them, mercifully, were likely either killed instantly or knocked unconscious by the sudden force of the plane coming apart, and therefore wouldn't have had to experience the horrifying sensation of falling 31,000 feet to the ground. None of them had a chance of survival. All 259 people on board had been killed. 11 people on the ground also died, for a total of 270, the deadliest airline disaster in UK history. Alright, we'll get back to today's video in just a moment, but first, here's a quick word from today's sponsor, Surfshark. Do you use the internet? I'm guessing that you might. And unfortunately, the internet can be a bit of a weird place. There are people out there who want to ruin your day. They want to take your details, maybe even steal your identity. Fortunately, Surfshark has HackLock. That searches databases for your passwords, which sounds like a bad thing, but it's not. Surfshark are the good guys. They let you know if your password has been leaked somewhere, and you can go in and change it and stay nice and safe. Also, even better than that, I mean, online safety is nice, but what about entertainment? Maybe you've reached the end of your Netflix, I've got nothing else to watch. Well, don't worry about that. Other countries have different options on Netflix, and you can access, and other streaming services, of course, and you can access those by installing Surfshark, firing it up, and then opening your streaming platform of choice, and you'll find that there are loads of other options, allegedly. Surfshark's also totally unlimited, so you can download as much as you want with no worries, and of course there are no logs, there's great support, and there's a 30-day money-back guarantee if you don't like it. Right now, you guys can get 83% off and 3 months for free through the link in the description below, or just use my code GEOGRAPHICS. And now, let's get back to today's video. Investigators from the UK's Air Accidents Investigation Branch, AAIB, arrived on the scene and took command of an army of over 2,000 police and military members who were combing through Lockerbie and the surrounding area for pieces of wreckage. The large area of the debris field indicated to investigators that the aircraft had disintegrated at high altitude. If the plane had been in one piece when it hit the ground, the wreckage would have been contained in a smaller area. With no distress calls coming from the aircraft, they knew whatever had happened fast, leaving only 2 possibilities: sudden, massive structural failure, or deliberate sabotage. Some sort of mechanical malfunction could not be ruled out. The Clipper Maid of the Seas was 18 years old, having been built for Pan Am in 1970, just the 15th Boeing 747 ever built. In that time, it had racked up more than 75,000 flying hours. But only a few failures would lead to such a catastrophic breakup, and so far, no indications of any of those had been found. The break in the case came when the wreckage recovered from the area of the forward cargo compartment showed signs of having been near an explosion. Chemical analysis of the wreckage indicated traces of the plastic explosive Semtex. It was conclusive evidence. Flight 103 had been destroyed by a bomb. With 270 murder victims, it was the worst terrorist attack in British history, and the site of Lockerbie was now the world's largest crime scene. Investigators from the American FBI, as well as the Scottish police, took over the investigation and were able to determine, based on the wreckage, that the bomb had been placed inside a Toshiba boombox-style radio that was packed in a hard-sided Samsonite suitcase. The bomb wasn't that big, but it didn't need to be. Even a small explosion on board an aircraft can tear it apart. The pressure waves caused by the blast will reverberate off the inside walls of the fuselage multiple times in the span of milliseconds until it finds a weak spot and tears a hole in the aircraft's skin. The force of the pressurized air escaping into the atmosphere does the rest of the damage, ripping it to pieces. Despite all their progress, the investigation still needed to answer the most important question: who had put the bomb on Pan Am Flight 103? There was no shortage of people who might want to blow up an American airliner in 1988. Iran was the most obvious suspect. 6 months earlier, in July, an Iranian passenger jet was shot down by a US Navy warship after its crew mistakenly identified it as a fighter jet preparing to attack them. 290 people had died in the accident, and Iran, who didn't have the best diplomatic relations with the United States to begin with, had vowed to take revenge. Other possible culprits included the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, PLFP, a radical terrorist group opposed to America's support for Israel. Investigators even considered the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, as possible suspects, considering the flight's origin in London and it being at the height of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. A fragment of a circuit board found within another piece of wreckage eventually proved to be the decisive clue. It was matched to an electronic timing device manufactured by the Swiss electronics company Meatball. Upon interviewing Meatball's owner in Zurich, they discovered the company had been doing business for years with the Libyan government and had sold 20 of the timing devices in question to the Libyans in 1985. Libya was another country that had fraught relations with the United States. Its leader, Muammar Gaddafi, had seized power in a coup in 1969, promising to end government corruption and raise the standard of living for ordinary Libyans. But over the following decades, Gaddafi's regime had descended into a dictatorship where everything revolved around him. A cult of personality had sprung up around the brotherly leader, with his face and quotations everywhere in the country. The problem was Gaddafi was an impulsive person who at times made seemingly irrational decisions, especially when he was angry. He had fought wars with his neighbors in Egypt and Chad and took steps to silence dissidents through an extensive intelligence and surveillance network. He was not above silencing his critics through assassination. Gaddafi, above all, hated the West and the United States in particular, calling it colonialist and oppressive. He was sponsoring practically every terrorist group in the world at one point, causing the US to put Libya on its list of state sponsors of terrorism in 1979. When Ronald Reagan took office in 1981, he took a hard line against rogue nations like Libya, something Gaddafi took personally. He also took personally his portrayal in the Western media, which usually depicted him as a cartoonish figure, swaggering about in a military uniform, making grand pronouncements he couldn't back up. The flashpoint of the conflict between the United States and Libya was the Gulf of Sidra, which takes up the center of the Libyan coastline. In 1973, Libya had claimed the entire Gulf as part of its territorial waters. This was a violation of international law, which dictated that everything more than 12 nautical miles away from a country's coast was international waters open to everyone. Gaddafi claimed that the boundary of the Gulf of Sidra was a so-called line of death, and that any ship or aircraft that crossed it without Libya's permission would be subject to attack. President Reagan ordered the US Navy into the Gulf of Sidra on what were called freedom of navigation exercises, asserting the Navy's right to sail or fly anywhere that they considered international waters. In effect, what these exercises did was challenge Gaddafi to come out and fight, which he did on several occasions. An early incident in 1981 resulted in American fighter jets shooting down 2 Libyan planes. But it was in 1986 that things really started to heat up. In March of that year, the Navy sent an aircraft carrier strike group into the Gulf of Sidra and came under attack by Libyan naval vessels and missile installations. The resulting shootout was a huge defeat for Gaddafi, who retaliated by sending intelligence agents to West Berlin in April, where they bombed a nightclub popular with US servicemen, killing 3 and wounding over 200. 10 days later, Reagan responded by ordering a large-scale airstrike on Libya, killing an estimated 75 people and doing a lot of damage to Libyan military infrastructure. Gaddafi was reportedly humiliated by his seeming inability to get one over on the Americans and spent months in isolation in one of his desert palaces. Things got even worse for Libya and Gaddafi a year later, when US satellite intelligence proved crucial in a crushing defeat of the Libyan military by Chad, resulting in the end of Libya's invasion of that country, which had begun in 1983. With his dreams of African hegemony crushed and with his nation growing increasingly isolated due to US-led sanctions, Gaddafi was left with a simmering rage against the United States, and he itched to take revenge. Clothing determined to be inside the same suitcase containing the bomb was found to have tags that said Made in Malta. This led investigators to a clothing store in Malta who said he remembered a Libyan man coming into his store not long before the bombing and buying some clothes. The man stuck out because it appeared that he bought the clothes at random without really paying attention to what he was getting, a mixture of adult and baby clothes and an umbrella, all of which were determined to have been in the bomb case. A composite sketch of the suspect was compiled and was then identified by the co-owner of Meatball, Edwin Edwin Bollier as the same man that had first met in Libya in 1985 after delivering the timers to the Libyan military and participating in a demonstration of the timers being used in explosive devices. This man was identified as Abdelbaset al-Megrahi, officially the head of security for Libyan Arab Airlines, but also believed to be a Libyan intelligence officer. Megrahi, together with another man named Lamin, Khalifah, Fhimah, had actually set up a business together in Mead's offices in Zurich that was believed to be acting as a front for Libyan intelligence. The FBI and Scottish police now believed that Megrahi, aided by Fhimah, had been the one to put the bomb in the suitcase and booked it onto a flight from Malta to Frankfurt, then on to London and New York. Megrahi himself did not board any of these flights, merely buying the ticket and shipping the bag off before disappearing. In November 1991, after an investigation that lasted nearly 3 years, the Scottish police announced indictments for murder against both Megrahi and Fhimah, telling the world that they were the ones responsible for the bombing of Pan Am Flight 103 at the behest of the Libyan government. The world reaction was largely one of outrage at Libya's actions, especially since Gaddafi refused to extradite the two accused men to face trial in Scotland. Justice was on hold for years as the two men hid out in Libya, out of reach of authorities, until Gaddafi was finally convinced to give them up as part of an attempt to thaw relations with the West. In 1999, a special trial was set up in the Netherlands for the two Lockerbie bombing suspects, who finally surrendered themselves to the custody of the Scottish court and were held in a specially created jail in an abandoned US Air Force base in Utrecht to await trial. A special panel of 3 Scottish judges presided over the highly publicised trial. 11 years after the bombing in May 2000, the trial began and lasted a grueling 36 weeks before the judges retired to consider the verdict. In January 2001, the judges announced their verdict. Abdelbaset al-Megrahi was convicted of 270 counts of murder for placing the bomb on board Pan Am Flight 103 and sentenced to life imprisonment. Lamin, Khalifah, Fhimah, on the other hand, was acquitted based on evidence that he was in Sweden at the time of the bombing and thus couldn't have taken part. Jailed in Scotland, Megrahi didn't end up staying there long. He was released from prison in 2009 on compassionate grounds, since he was dying of prostate cancer, and he was sent home to Libya. Expected to only live for a few months, he instead lingered on until 2012, when he died at the age of 60. Gaddafi and the Libyan government formally admitted responsibility for bombing Pan Am Flight 103 in 2003 and agreed to pay more than $2 billion to the victims' families as part of a deal to lift UN sanctions and US sanctions against the country. Gaddafi himself never went on trial for the bombing, though most investigators believe that at the very least he had prior knowledge of the bomb plot, but he would eventually face a kind of justice of his own. His regime fell in 2011 following a violent civil war with the anti-Gaddafi faction supported by airstrikes provided by NATO jets. Shortly after, Gaddafi was killed after being captured by the rebels, along with one of his sons. The truly tragic part of this story is how easily it could have been prevented. The bag containing the bomb was put onto 3 different planes without the passenger who bought the ticket also being on the plane. This is a violation of what is known as the Passenger Baggage Reconciliation, a rule that states that every piece of luggage that goes on a plane must have an accompanying passenger on board with it. The rule, designed precisely to prevent tragedies like this from happening, had already been mandated as a requirement by the FAA, and Pan Am should have been following it. And yet, both in Frankfurt and in London, they failed to detect the suspect bag. They didn't even search the bag by hand, also a requirement. Instead, they relied on X-ray screening, which was less time-consuming, but also less effective. The security lapse proved to be the death knell for Pan Am. Found guilty by a federal court of willful misconduct and faced with a massive $300 million lawsuit by the victims' families, the airline declared bankruptcy in January 1991 and had ceased operations in December of that year. The legacy left by the collapse of Pan Am is that passenger baggage reconciliation is now a standard requirement for almost every airline that flies worldwide, and security screenings of bags brought on board planes have dramatically improved. Lockerbie was the first time the FBI had investigated a major international terrorist attack perpetrated against Americans, and as a result, the Lockerbie investigation set the standard for how the FBI handled future investigations, which unfortunately became more common throughout the 1990s and 2000s as terrorist groups like al-Qaeda stepped up their campaigns on American citizens. Sadly, they hadn't learnt everything they needed to, as the events of September the 11th eclipsed Lockerbie as America's worst terrorist attack, the same year that the verdicts were reached against the accused bombers of Pan Am 103. Perhaps the best legacy to take away from the tragedy of Lockerbie is how, even in the depths of unspeakable evil, the goodness and decency of ordinary people shines through. Despite shouldering their own grief for the loss of their neighbours, the residents of Lockerbie were welcoming and accommodating to the families of the victims on the plane, many of whom came to the town in the days after the bombing. A group of women, known as the Laundry Ladies, spent more than a year recovering and cleaning the personal effects and clothing of the plane's passengers, storing them in a property storeroom until they could be returned to their families, a small act of compassion that touched many. Many family members visit Lockerbie regularly, both to remember their lost loved ones and to meet with townspeople they've become friends with in the years since the disaster. As for Lockerbie itself, things have more or less returned to normal in the town of 4,000. People continue to go about their lives as they always have, and you wouldn't know, just by looking at it, that it was the site of something so awful. The homes on Sherwood Crescent have been rebuilt, except for one spot in the corner, with a small stone monument and a memorial garden marking where the wings of the plane came down. It's not as large or as well visited as the official memorial located a mile to the west at Dryfesdale Cemetery, but in its own way, it serves as a reminder of that day over 30 years ago when fire rained down and tore apart this small Scottish town where nothing is ever supposed to happen. So I hope you enjoyed today's video. Before you leave, let me tell you about a new channel that I'm doing called Into the Shadows. So maybe the world isn't dark enough for you. Well, good news, it absolutely is. And if you'd like to know more about the horrible things that humans have been doing to each other since, well, time immemorial, well, please check out that new channel, Into the Shadows. From landmines to penal colonies to horrific diseases, if it's horrific, we cover it. Check it out through the link in the description below. Again, it's called Into the Shadows. And thank you for watching.